Is this really the hill you want to die on? The question drifted across the quiet entrance to Arlington National Cemetery, with just enough edge to cut through the respectful silence gathering beneath an overcast Virginia sky. Corporal Ethan Brooks folded his arms across the crisp blue fabric of his dress uniform, planting himself squarely in front of the elderly stranger who had stopped a few feet from the security checkpoint. Behind him, black government sedans rolled slowly through the tree-lined avenue, while rows of American flags stirred gently in the cool morning breeze. Every movement around the cemetery carried the solemn precision reserved for a four-star general's funeral, and every minute mattered. A voice crackled through Brooks' shoulder radio. Motorcade arriving in 2 minutes. The young corporal glanced toward the distant convoy before returning his attention to the old man, standing quietly with both hands resting on the handle of a weathered leather garment bag. The stranger looked to be well into his 80s. His charcoal suit had been carefully pressed, but the cuffs had faded with age, and his polished black shoes bore the unmistakable marks of decades rather than neglect. Nothing about him suggested importance. Nothing about him matched the list of senators, generals, admirals, ambassadors, and decorated officers expected to attend General Richard Holloway's final farewell. Yet he neither argued nor retreated. He simply stood there, his pale blue eyes fixed beyond the checkpoint toward the distant white canopy where military honors were already being prepared. The silence unsettled Brooks more than any protest would have. Most people explained themselves. Some complained. Others demanded exceptions. This man did none of those things. He simply waited with a patience that seemed strangely untouched by the pressure building around him. Another guard checked the invitation roster for a second time before shaking his head. "I'm sorry, sir. There's no record of your name." The old man nodded once, almost as though he had expected the answer. "My name is Thomas Callahan," he said quietly. "General Holloway wanted me here." Brooks exchanged an amused glance with the other guard before letting out a restrained chuckle. "Sir, General Holloway knew presidents. He advised the Joint Chiefs. Today is invitation only." Nearby, clusters of mourners began noticing the exchange. Distinguished officers paused their conversations. Family members carrying white roses looked toward the gate with uncertain expressions. A television camera quietly shifted its focus before an aide motioned for it to point elsewhere. No one wanted unnecessary attention before the ceremony. The radio sounded again, this time sharper. Motorcade entering the outer gate. 90 seconds. Brooks felt the weight of responsibility settle onto his shoulders. Security had been drilled into every member of the detail for weeks. Nobody entered without clearance. Nobody. Just then the polished heels of Second Lieutenant Ryan Mercer clicked across the stone walkway. Fresh from officer candidate school and eager to demonstrate authority, he approached with brisk confidence, stopping beside Brooks before studying Thomas from head to toe. His eyes lingered on the elderly man's plain suit, the worn leather bag, and finally the small tarnished bronze pin fastened neatly to his lapel. It was no official decoration Brooks recognized, no polished metal, no campaign ribbon worthy of military ceremony. Just an oddly shaped piece of aged metal that looked almost forgotten by time. Mercer offered a tight smile that never reached his eyes. "Sir," he said evenly, "you're holding up the entrance to the funeral of one of the most respected generals in American history. Unless you have credentials, I'm going to have to ask you to leave immediately." Thomas never looked at the lieutenant. His eyes remained fixed beyond the gates where rows of white headstones stretched into the distance beneath the whispering flags, as though someone waiting there mattered far more than anyone standing in front of him. Thomas Callahan finally shifted his gaze from the distant rows of white headstones to the young lieutenant standing before him. His expression did not harden, nor did it soften. It remained remarkably calm, carrying the quiet steadiness of a man who had spent a lifetime watching storms pass without feeling the need to outrun them. The morning breeze lifted the edge of his suit jacket before settling again beneath the towering oaks that lined the cemetery road. Somewhere farther inside the grounds, the faint sound of a bugler rehearsing a few careful notes drifted across the hills before fading into silence. The entire place seemed to be holding its breath. Lieutenant Ryan Mercer glanced toward the approaching motorcade, then back to Thomas with growing impatience. Every passing second increased the pressure. Black sport utility vehicles had already reached the outer security perimeter, their headlights moving slowly between the rows of flags. Staff officers adjusted earpieces. Military police quietly redirected arriving guests. Everything operated with practiced precision, except for the lone elderly man standing exactly where protocol insisted no one should remain. "Sir," Mercer said more firmly, "this is your final opportunity to cooperate. If General Holloway invited you personally, then your name would be on the guest list." Thomas answered without raising his voice. Richard never worried much about lists. Brooks released a short laugh before catching himself. The response sounded almost absurd. Around them, several distinguished guests exchanged puzzled glances. A retired admiral lowered his sunglasses for a closer look. An elderly woman carrying a single white lily paused near the pathway, watching the conversation unfold with growing concern. No one recognized Thomas, yet something about the way he carried himself made it strangely difficult to dismiss him as confused or lost. Mercer took one deliberate step closer. "General Holloway," he corrected, emphasizing every syllable. "You will refer to him properly." Thomas looked toward the fluttering American flag above the ceremonial pavilion. A faint smile crossed his weathered face, so brief it almost disappeared before anyone noticed. "He spent 40 years asking me not to call him General whenever nobody else was listening." Brooks shook his head in disbelief. "That is enough." The corporal extended one arm toward the public entrance farther down the road. "You can pay your respects another day. Today is reserved for invited guests and official family." Thomas neither moved nor argued. Instead, he slowly reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. Brooks immediately straightened. Mercer lifted one hand in cautious warning while another guard instinctively stepped forward. Thomas withdrew nothing more than a folded handkerchief, smoothing it carefully between both palms before placing it back inside his pocket. The simple gesture somehow made the silence even heavier. His movements carried no trace of nervousness, only the careful rhythm of someone who refused to rush moments that mattered. The radio at Brooks' shoulder crackled once more. Motorcade entering the ceremonial lane. 60 seconds. Mercer exhaled sharply. Decision time had arrived. He glanced toward the approaching convoy, then toward Thomas again. "Escort him beyond the gate," he ordered quietly. "Do it respectfully, but clear the entrance before the convoy arrives." Brooks nodded and stepped forward, reaching out with measured caution. Before his hand could touch Thomas's sleeve, a voice spoke from several yards away. "Lieutenant." It was calm, professional, and carried just enough authority to stop everyone in place. Captain Noah Hayes had been standing among the arriving officers, silently observing every minute of the encounter. He had noticed the old man's posture, the stillness in his eyes, and something else that refused to leave his thoughts. It was not the faded suit or the worn shoes. It was the unmistakable look of someone who had spent an entire lifetime carrying memories that did not need to be explained. Captain Noah Hayes did not raise his voice, yet every head within earshot turned toward him. There was nothing dramatic in his posture, only the quiet confidence of an officer who had learned that the smallest details often carried the greatest weight. He walked slowly across the stone pathway, his polished shoes making soft clicks that disappeared beneath the whisper of the morning wind. Brooks straightened immediately. Mercer looked mildly irritated by the interruption, but stepped aside just enough to acknowledge the captain's senior rank. Hayes stopped a few feet from Thomas and studied him carefully. The old man's face revealed almost nothing. Deep lines framed steady blue eyes that never wandered. His shoulders remained relaxed despite the growing crowd and the mounting tension. Hayes had seen that kind of composure only a handful of times during 2 overseas deployments. It was not confidence born from pride. It was something quieter, forged by years of carrying responsibility without expecting recognition. The captain noticed the weathered garment bag resting beside Thomas's leg. He noticed the careful shine on shoes that had clearly been polished by hand. Then his attention settled on the small bronze pin fastened neatly above the left lapel. It was oddly shaped, scratched by time, and completely unfamiliar. Yet it did not resemble a souvenir or novelty item. It looked personal, deliberate, worn because it mattered rather than because it impressed anyone. Mercer folded his arms. "Captain, this gentleman claims General Holloway invited him personally, but there is no record of his name anywhere." Hayes nodded without taking his eyes off Thomas. "Did you ask for identification?" Brooks answered first. "Only his name, sir. Thomas Callahan." The captain repeated the name, silently inside his own thoughts. Somehow it sounded familiar, though he could not place where he had heard it. Perhaps an old briefing. Perhaps a veterans event years earlier. Perhaps nowhere at all. Still, the feeling lingered. Hayes looked directly at Thomas. "Sir, would you mind telling me how you knew General Holloway?" Thomas turned toward the distant ceremonial pavilion where members of the honor guard were quietly taking their positions. For several long seconds, he simply watched the flags moving above the white canopy before speaking in the same calm voice that never seemed to rise above ordinary conversation. "We made each other a promise a very long time ago." Hayes waited for more, but Thomas offered nothing further. There was no attempt to persuade anyone. No dramatico explanation. Just a simple sentence carrying far more history than words could hold. Mercer released a slow breath. "Captain, we do not have time for riddles. The convoy is almost here." As if answering him, the low rumble of approaching engines rolled across the cemetery road. Black vehicles emerged beyond the tree line, moving with measured precision toward the main entrance. Staff officers immediately adjusted their positions while members of the security detail straightened their uniforms one final time. Every eye shifted toward the arriving convoy, except Thomas's. He remained focused on the pavilion, almost as though the approaching motorcade had no importance at all. Hayes felt an unexpected hesitation settle over him. Regulations were clear. Procedure left very little room for instinct. Yet every instinct he possessed insisted that something about this elderly man did not fit the story unfolding around him. He slipped one hand into his pocket and quietly retrieved his phone without attracting Mercer's attention. If Thomas Callahan truly meant nothing, one discreet call would settle the matter in less than a minute. But if his instincts were right, then forcing this quiet old man to leave before making that call might become a mistake no one present would ever forget. Captain Noah Hayes stepped away from the growing crowd with measured composure, shielding his phone from the curious eyes gathering near the checkpoint. Behind him, the quiet murmur of arriving guests blended with the distant hum of idling engines as the first vehicles of the official convoy rolled slowly beneath the rows of towering oaks. Every movement around the cemetery reflected careful ceremony, yet Hayes felt increasingly disconnected from the perfectly rehearsed schedule unfolding around him. His attention remained fixed on one name, Thomas Callahan. He opened an old contact that he rarely used, a direct number belonging to Colonel Daniel Whitaker, General Holloway's longtime executive officer. The phone rang only once before the familiar voice answered. "Whitaker." Hayes kept his tone respectful. "Sir, I apologize for interrupting. I need to verify a guest before the ceremony begins." There was a brief pause. "Go ahead." Hayes glanced back toward the entrance where Brooks and Mercer still stood with Thomas. The elderly man had not moved an inch. He seemed almost untouched by the tension surrounding him, watching the white ceremonial tent as though every passing second carried a private memory known only to him. "The gentleman's name is Thomas Callahan," Hayes said quietly. "He claims General Holloway personally wanted him here, but there is no invitation under his name." Silence answered him for nearly 3 seconds. Then Whitaker spoke again, his voice noticeably different. "Did you say Thomas Callahan?" Hayes straightened unconsciously. "Yes, sir." Another silence followed, longer this time. Hayes could hear papers moving quickly on the other end of the line before Whitaker spoke in a tone that had lost every trace of casual conversation. "Captain, do not remove that man from the gate." Hayes blinked. "Sir, I said do not let him leave." Hayes looked back toward the entrance. Mercer was speaking again, gesturing politely but firmly toward the public access road while Brooks remained beside him. Thomas simply listened without interrupting either soldier. Whitaker returned to the line. "Stay exactly where you are." His breathing had become noticeably quicker. "I need to make another call immediately." The connection ended before Hayes could ask another question. He lowered the phone slowly, his heartbeat settling into a heavier rhythm. Whatever Colonel Whitaker had recognized, it had happened instantly. There had been no questions about dates, units, identification numbers, or service records. Only the name itself. Hayes slipped the phone back into his pocket just as another low rumble rolled across the cemetery entrance. The lead vehicle of the motorcade rounded the final curve, polished black, paint reflecting the gray morning sky. Members of the honor guard shifted into perfect alignment, while aides hurried toward their assigned positions. The funeral was seconds away from beginning. At the checkpoint, Mercer had apparently reached the end of his patience. "Sir," he said with controlled firmness, "I respect your intentions, but I cannot delay this ceremony any longer. I'm asking you one last time to step away from the entrance." Thomas finally looked directly at the young lieutenant. There was neither frustration nor disappointment in his eyes, only a quiet sadness that seemed far older than the moment itself. He gave a small nod and spoke so softly that everyone nearest instinctively leaned closer to hear. Richard always hated making people wait. As those words settled into the morning air, Mercer's gaze drifted toward the small bronze pin on Thomas's lapel. Its worn surface caught a narrow beam of sunlight breaking through the clouds. Without thinking, and believing it was nothing more than an old trinket, the lieutenant reached toward it with 2 fingers. Lieutenant Ryan Mercer brushed 2 fingers against the small bronze pin with the casual confidence of someone expecting to expose nothing more than an old keepsake. "Interesting souvenir," he said with a faint smile that carried more skepticism than curiosity. "It is not military issue, and it certainly is not recognized insignia." Before Thomas could respond, Mercer gently lifted the edge of the weathered pin from the fabric of the lapel. The aged clasp, weakened by decades of careful use, slipped free. The piece of bronze struck the smooth stone walkway with a sharp metallic click that echoed far louder than its size should have allowed. Every nearby conversation seemed to stop for a heartbeat. The tiny object spun once, twice, then settled beneath the pale morning light. Thomas's eyes followed it to the ground. Until that instant, his expression had never changed. Now something almost impossible to describe crossed his face. It was not anger. It was not fear. It was the quiet ache of someone watching a memory touch the earth after carrying it safely for half a lifetime. He slowly bent his knees, intending to retrieve it himself, but Mercer instinctively reached first. "I have it," the lieutenant said, picking up the oddly shaped piece of bronze between his fingertips. He turned it over with mild amusement. The object looked unfinished, its edges rough rather than polished, its surface scratched by years of careful handling instead of neglect. There are no official markings, no engraved rank, no decorative finish. It looked more like a fragment than a medal. Brooks leaned closer. "That is what all this is about?" he asked. "It looks like someone broke a piece off an old machine." Mercer nodded. "Probably sentimental, but hardly worth delaying a state funeral." Thomas finally raised his hand, palm open but steady. "Please." His voice remained soft. "Give it back." Mercer hesitated for only a second before examining it one last time. "If it means that much to you, perhaps you should keep it somewhere safer." The lieutenant placed the bronze fragment into Thomas's waiting hand. The instant the worn metal touched his weathered palm, the world around him seemed to fade beneath the weight of memory. The quiet breeze through Arlington's trees dissolved into the rhythmic pulse of distant helicopter blades carried across humid jungle air. The scent of fresh-cut grass gave way to damp earth after heavy rain. Young Lieutenant Richard Holloway sat against the twisted remains of a damaged helicopter, exhaustion covering his face while sunlight filtered through layers of dense green canopy overhead. Thomas was no older than 23 then, kneeling beside him with dirt across his sleeves, and sweat running down his brow. Neither man spoke for several long moments. They simply listened to the fading sound of rotor blades disappearing beyond the trees, knowing another aircraft would not return before nightfall. Richard looked down at a jagged piece of scorched bronze that had broken loose from a damaged identification plate near the aircraft's cockpit. He turned it slowly between his fingers before giving a tired smile. "Nobody will ever write about today," he said quietly. "Most of what happened here will probably stay locked away forever." Thomas answered with a small shrug. "That does not change what happened." Richard nodded. Using the edge of a field tool, he carefully smoothed one side of the bronze fragment before pressing it into Thomas's hand. "Then keep this," he said. "Not because anyone else will understand it. Because every time you see it, you will remember that we walked out together." The memory lingered for only an instant before the whispering trees of Arlington slowly returned. Thomas closed his fingers gently around the bronze pin, drawing one careful breath as the distant sound of approaching engines once again filled the quiet morning. Across the entrance, Captain Noah Hayes felt his phone begin to vibrate inside his pocket. Captain Noah Hayes stepped away from the entrance before answering the vibrating phone, instinctively lowering his voice as the convoy continued its slow approach along the winding cemetery road. The morning air carried the scent of freshly cut grass, polished leather, and damp earth after an overnight drizzle. Every flag lining the avenue rose and fell in the gentle breeze with quiet rhythm, while the distant bugle rehearsed another solemn phrase that faded into silence almost as quickly as it appeared. Hayes accepted the call. "Captain Hayes." The voice on the other end belonged to Colonel Daniel Whitaker, but it no longer sounded composed. Every word carried unmistakable urgency. "Captain, listen carefully. Where is Mr. Thomas Callahan right now?" Hayes turned toward the checkpoint. Thomas still stood exactly where he had been from the beginning, one hand resting lightly over the small bronze fragment inside his closed palm. Brooks and Mercer remained nearby, both appearing increasingly uncertain after watching the elderly man's unexpected reaction to the simple piece of metal. "He is still at the entrance, sir," Hayes replied. "Good." Whitaker exhaled slowly. "Keep him there. Do not let anyone escort him away. I have already contacted General Michael Brennan." Hayes frowned. "Sir, may I ask who Thomas Callahan actually is?" Another brief silence followed. When Whitaker finally answered, his voice had softened with unmistakable respect. "Captain, some names disappear from official ceremonies because the people carrying them never asked to be remembered. Thomas Callahan is one of those names." Hayes remained silent, allowing the colonel to continue. General Holloway rarely spoke about the earliest years of his career. Whenever he did, there was only one man he always mentioned before discussing anyone else. Hayes looked once more toward the quiet old veteran standing beneath the waving flags. "Thomas?" "Yes." Whitaker answered without hesitation. "General Holloway once told me that every meaningful chapter of his military life existed because one young soldier chose loyalty over recognition. He never elaborated beyond that, and whenever someone pressed for details, he ended the conversation." Hayes felt the weight of those words settle into his thoughts. "Then why is there no invitation?" "Because General Holloway insisted there would never need to be one." Whitaker's answer came almost immediately. He believed Thomas would come if he was able, and if he came, everyone responsible would know exactly what to do. Hayes lowered his eyes briefly. No one had known what to do. Not Brooks. Not Mercer. Not even himself. The colonel spoke again. "General Brennan was informed less than 2 minutes ago. He has already changed his route." Hayes looked instinctively toward the lead vehicle of the convoy. It had begun slowing well before reaching the ceremonial entrance. Staff officers along the roadway exchanged puzzled glances as quiet instructions passed rapidly through their earpieces. Something in the carefully rehearsed schedule had suddenly changed. Hayes ended the call and slipped the phone into his pocket, his heartbeat noticeably heavier than before. Around him, guests continued watching the elderly stranger with uncertain curiosity, unaware that the atmosphere surrounding the entrance had shifted in ways they could not yet understand. Thomas remained completely still, gently rubbing the edge of the worn bronze fragment with his thumb as though polishing a memory invisible to everyone else. He never looked toward the approaching convoy. Instead, his eyes rested once again upon the white canopy in the distance, where the flag above the ceremonial platform fluttered quietly against the gray Virginia sky. It almost seemed as though he already knew someone was coming, not because of rank or authority, but because a promise made decades earlier had finally reached the moment when it would be honored. The lead vehicle of the convoy slowed to a complete stop nearly 100 yards short of the ceremonial entrance, a deviation so unexpected that every member of the security detail instinctively looked toward one another for confirmation. This had not been part of the schedule rehearsed over the previous week. Drivers remained behind their wheels. Military aides pressed fingers against discreet earpieces as quiet voices flowed through secure channels. No alarm sounded. No commands were shouted. Yet an unmistakable wave of uncertainty spread across the entrance. Lieutenant Ryan Mercer frowned toward the convoy. Why are they stopping? Brooks had no answer. Captain Noah Hayes did. He simply chose not to speak yet. The words Colonel Whitaker had spoken only moments earlier continued echoing in his mind. General Brennan was changing his route. Hayes watched as one aide hurried from the second vehicle to the lead sedan, leaned through the open rear window for only a few seconds, then immediately stepped back and rendered a crisp salute. The rear passenger door never opened. Instead, the convoy remained motionless beneath the rows of fluttering American flags, while another message traveled through the radios worn by officers positioned along the cemetery road. The honor guard standing near the white pavilion exchanged brief glances before subtly adjusting formation. Several distinguished guests turned from their conversations, quietly wondering why the ceremony had not begun. A retired admiral removed his cap and shaded his eyes, trying to understand the unexpected delay. Family members looked toward the entrance with growing curiosity. They knew something had interrupted the carefully orchestrated sequence, but none of them knew what. Thomas Callahan remained exactly where he had always been. He stood with both feet planted comfortably on the stone walkway, one hand gently closed around the small bronze fragment resting inside his palm. His shoulders stayed relaxed. His breathing remained slow and even. The only movement came from the breeze, lifting a strand of silver hair above his forehead before letting it settle once more. He neither watched the convoy nor searched the faces around him for recognition. Instead, his attention rested quietly on the distant flag above the ceremonial platform, as though his thoughts belonged somewhere many decades removed. From the present morning, Captain Hayes walked back toward Brooks and Mercer, stopping beside them with composed authority. "Nobody touches him," he said quietly. Mercer looked surprised. "Sir," Hayes met his eyes without hesitation. "That is not a suggestion." Brooks immediately straightened. Mercer opened his mouth as though preparing to object, then noticed something in the captain's expression that convinced him otherwise. This was no longer ordinary caution. Hayes had received information significant enough to override instinct, routine, and pride all at once. Before either younger man could ask another question, every radio at the entrance crackled almost simultaneously. A calm voice transmitted one clear instruction across the security channel. "Attention, all personnel. Hold current positions. Repeat, hold current positions until further notice." Brooks lowered his hand from his radio, exchanging a puzzled glance with Mercer. Neither had ever heard a funeral procession pause this way. Hayes slowly looked toward the lead sedan once more. The rear passenger door finally opened. A polished black shoe touched the pavement, followed by the unmistakable figure of General Michael Brennan. Instead of walking toward the white canopy where hundreds of mourners waited, the four-star general turned immediately toward the cemetery entrance. Without a word to anyone beside him, he began walking directly toward Thomas Callahan. General Michael Brennan walked with deliberate, unhurried steps, ignoring the carefully planned route that had been prepared for him weeks in advance. His polished shoes crossed the stone pathway without hesitation, the 4 silver stars on his shoulders catching brief flashes of pale sunlight as the clouds slowly drifted apart above Arlington. Behind him, senior officers exchanged uncertain looks before instinctively following several paces behind. Members of the honor guard remained frozen in perfect formation, waiting for instructions that no longer seemed to apply. Guests lining the entrance watched in complete silence as the highest-ranking officer present abandoned the ceremonial procession and headed instead toward a quiet old man. Standing outside the gate, Brooks swallowed hard. "Lieutenant," he whispered, never taking his eyes off the approaching general. "He is coming here." Mercer did not answer. The confident certainty that had guided him only moments earlier had quietly disappeared. He glanced toward Captain Noah Hayes, hoping for an explanation, but Hayes merely stood at attention, his expression calm, yet unmistakably respectful. He had already understood what everyone else was only beginning to realize. Thomas Callahan remained exactly where he had always been, one hand gently closed around the worn bronze fragment resting in his palm. He watched General Brennan approach without surprise, almost as though he had expected this meeting long before anyone else had recognized it was about to happen. The distance between them slowly disappeared until only a few feet remained. General Brennan stopped. For a brief moment, neither man spoke. The breeze lifted the edges of their jackets while the flags above them whispered softly against the gray Virginia sky. Around them, hundreds of people waited without making a sound. Then the general's eyes settled on the small bronze fragment visible inside Thomas's weathered hand. His expression changed instantly. The disciplined composure expected of a 4-star officer gave way to something far more personal. Respect. Deep, unmistakable respect. He removed his dress cap slowly and held it beneath one arm. "Mr. Callahan," he said quietly, "I was afraid we might be too late." Thomas offered the faintest smile. "You were right on time, Michael." Hearing the general addressed by his first name sent another ripple through the silent crowd. Mercer stared in disbelief. Brooks felt the color drain from his face. Even the senior officers following several yards behind stopped where they stood, recognizing that they were witnessing something never mentioned in any official program. General Brennan nodded once before looking briefly toward the ceremonial pavilion in the distance. "Richard made us promise," he said softly. "He said that if you came, everything else could wait." Thomas lowered his eyes for a moment, gently turning the bronze fragment between his fingers. He always disliked unnecessary attention. Brennan allowed himself a quiet smile. That never changed. He then turned toward Captain Hayes. "Captain." "Sir." "Thank you for making the call." Hayes answered with a respectful nod. It seemed like the right thing to do. Brennan looked back toward Thomas. "Colonel Whitaker reminded me of something Richard repeated every Memorial Day." His voice carried just far enough for those closest to hear. He always said there was only one man he never wanted standing outside, while everyone else stood inside. The general drew a slow breath before taking one careful step backward. Every eye at the entrance remained fixed upon him, sensing that the next quiet movement would say far more than any speech ever could. General Michael Brennan took one final step backward before raising his right hand in a slow, deliberate salute. It was not the sharp ceremonial motion reserved for cameras or official photographs. It was personal, quiet, earned. The gesture carried decades of gratitude that no speech could ever contain. For one suspended moment, the entire entrance seemed to forget the passage of time. The breeze continued moving through the rows of American flags, but no one else moved. Thomas Callahan looked at the general for several seconds before returning the salute with calm dignity. His hand rose without haste, steady despite the passing years, reflecting a discipline that had never truly faded. Around them, every conversation stopped. Brooks stood frozen beside the security barrier, his earlier certainty replaced by a growing realization that he had been standing in front of a man whose greatest accomplishments had never required introduction. Lieutenant Ryan Mercer lowered his eyes, replaying every word he had spoken since Thomas first arrived. None of them could be taken back. Captain Noah Hayes quietly stepped aside, allowing a clear path between the entrance and the ceremonial pavilion. General Brennan lowered his salute and spoke clearly enough for everyone nearby to hear. General Richard Holloway left one instruction that was never included in today's written program. He paused, looking briefly toward the white canopy where the folded American flag rested beside the flower-covered casket. He told us that if Thomas Callahan arrived, the ceremony would not begin until his oldest friend stood beside him one final time. A ripple of silence spread through the gathered crowd. Family members looked at Thomas with entirely different eyes. Senior officers straightened instinctively. Even the members of the honor guard seemed to stand a little taller. Brennan turned toward Brooks and Mercer, but there was no anger in his expression. These young men were doing exactly what they believed their duty required, he said calmly. Duty matters. So does remembering that not every record is kept on paper. Brooks swallowed hard before stepping forward. His voice came quietly. Mr. Callahan, I owe you an apology. Mercer removed his cap, holding it respectfully against his chest. So do I, sir. Thomas looked at both men for a long moment before offering the faint smile that had appeared only once before that morning. You protected the gate, he said gently. Never apologize for protecting what you were entrusted to protect. Just remember that sometimes history arrives wearing old shoes. Neither young soldier found words to answer. General Brennan extended one hand toward the pathway leading into the cemetery. Would you do us the honor? Thomas glanced once more at the small bronze fragment resting in his palm before carefully fastening it back onto his lapel. The worn piece of metal caught a narrow beam of sunlight, as though acknowledging a promise finally fulfilled. He nodded once. Together, the two old friends in spirit walked side by side toward the waiting ceremony, one carrying 4 stars upon his shoulders, the other carrying memories known only to those who had shared them. As they passed, the honor guard presented arms in flawless unison. Every officer along the pathway stood at attention. No command needed to be given. Respect traveled more quickly than orders ever could. The bugle finally began its solemn melody, echoing gently across the rolling hills as Thomas took his place beside the casket exactly where Richard Holloway had wanted him to stand. There were no grand speeches about forgotten heroes, no dramatic revelations, and no applause. Only quiet understanding settling over everyone present. Some legacies are written into official history. Others survive only because one loyal friend remembers another. And sometimes the greatest honor a person can receive is simply having someone keep a promise long after the world has forgotten why it mattered.